folks, Les here, and this is the first video that I want to do of kind of an ongoing series that are just quick tips on things that I've kind of picked up working with Daz Studio. Now, a lot of folks who are familiar with 6S1 from the past, would know that I kind of avoided Daz Studio for many years for a lot of reasons. I think that as a piece of software in general, it's just not been a very mature piece of software. If you wanted to do professional work like I have had to do with Poser for a long time, Daz Studio, in my opinion, just it was decent, but it didn't measure up until recently. Really back around December or so, there's just a number of things came together that made me really sit down and go, okay, what all's inside here, and where is it at now? And as I started looking at it, I found there's still things with it that I'm not fond of. I'll get that right off the bat. But the things that are done right in Daz Studio are done extremely right. And probably the biggest thing that I find is iRay. So iRay is just this amazing render engine from NVIDIA that is now inside Daz Studio. And so, like I do with a lot of things, I'll dig into it and just go all in, tearing the program apart, figuring out every little thing that I can get my hands on and all that stuff. So anyway, what I want to do is a series of videos that sort of collect some of the things that I've learned, just applying some of my experiences elsewhere to what I found when I came into Daz Studio really full bore. And also kind of addressing hopefully some things that folks have questions about with Daz Studio. But where I'm going to start off with is in my render settings, because one of the things that I found as I was trying to do renders and trying to work on specifically things for clients and for new products and things that we're going to roll out, I found that in the render settings, a lot of these dials were these sliders. They look like sliders in here. The dials and Poser are really the same thing. That a lot of these sliders would just go completely off the charts with their values. And I see posts from people like on Facebook or in the Daz forums, sometimes talking about good values and all that. And while it's cool to kind of know some values that you want to plug in, I got to thinking about it, and I was just looking and thought, well, if I'm editing a product, if I'm editing dials on a figure or something, and we can take the dials into edit mode there, and we can edit all kinds of stuff. And well, why can't you do that here? Well, you can, and it's just right here in this little gear icon on each of these dials. So, just as example, in the render settings, I like using Bloom. Typically, I would render out of Poser. I would render in layer passes or render passes. I would do blooming and things like that in post. And I still do that inside Daz Studio with iRay, because I'll render to canvases sometimes and use similar techniques, which is something for another video for another day. But what I'm finding is that a lot of folks don't realize that you can actually customize a lot of things in here to your own workflow really effectively. So here, for instance, this bloom filter radius. Okay, I like that softened look of blooming. When you first come in here, if you click and drag on this slider, you're going to get some absolutely insanely large values shoved into this thing. Both on radius, threshold, pretty much all of these are going to have these, get these kind of erratic looking values. And that's because they're not clamped down. One of the things that I found in Daz Studio is that all of the sliders, as soon as you place limits on them and turn those limits on, the slider itself changes and becomes much more responsive to actual interaction where you can play with it. So let's just jump into this real quick here with the bloom filter threshold. If I click on that little icon and I go to parameter settings, you'll see it brings up this little window that gives us access to all kinds of things about that slider. And this, even though it's not something that's on a figure, it's something that's really more part of the program. It's nice that we still have access to this here, um, because what we can do is, and you'll see that I've done right here, is I've set my max value for bloom filter threshold to 4,000. And then I've turned on use limits. By default, this is set to, I think, 20,000, and use limits is turned off. And you can, if you click and drag on that dial or that slider, it will just go all over the place. And pretty quickly, you'll find yourself actually unable to drag it far enough to the left to get it back down into a value where you actually see something happening. And that irritated me, which is what prompted me to go poking around and figure this out. So here you can see the default that it comes up at is 2000. You could set that if you have a default that something that you would prefer to have be your default. You could set that. And then nudge is the value by which that dial will move. That slider will move as you click and drag it. So I've just set my max to 4,000 and turned on use limits. Hit accept, and now I can actually click and drag on that and have a much more nuanced view of the changes it's going to make in my render as Iray updates. So, which it's going to take a second to update right now, just with the video capture software going. But there is that, and the same thing applies for let's say this bloom filter brightness scale. If we again click on the little gear, go to parameter settings, here you can see that I've set min to 0, max to 2, and set turned on use limits. Again, limits was not turned on by default here, and the max was some really huge number. And I kind of knew from having played around with it a bit that I wanted to clamp this between 0 and 2. Here you can see what our nudge rate is, and the default is 1. There we go. It's starting to come back. So let's take this bloom filter threshold down, and you can see it should update here in just a second. So then I'm going to do the same to my pixel filter radius. Pardon me, my sinuses are kind of acting up from allergies, so I'm going to be sniffling a little bit here, but such is the case with kind of raw videos like this. So I know that I'm never going to use a pixel filter radius of 16. I'm going to set that to a max of like 3. And use limits is on by default there. So I'm just going to accept that. And you'll see too that the slider jumps as those limits change. The scope of that slider changes, and you'll see it visually shift, though the number doesn't change. So anyway, that's just a quick look inside ways to kind of make all of this stuff a little more interactive. You'll find that once you make those changes and you click and drag on things, it feels to your hand with a mouse, or if you're like me using a Wacom pen. Wacom, I hate that word. I always said Wacom, apparently it's Wacom. But if you're like me using a Wacom pen, or just using a mouse, either way, when you click and drag on these after setting those kind of parameters, those limits and everything, you'll find that it's actually much more nuanced and responsive to work with. So that is all for this little installment, and I hope folks will come back and check out the next video.